My guest today is the swashbuckling 43rd governor of Arkansas, the Honorable Jim Guy Tucker. If ever there was a comeback kid, it is Jim Guy Jr., born tall, handsome, and smart. He graduated from Harvard, then joined the Marines. After finishing at the top of his class in officer candidate training, Jim Guy was honorably discharged due to health concerns. Not to be deterred, he adventurously hopped a freight liner to Southeast Asia, where he entrenched himself for 2 years as a freelance Vietnam War correspondent. He later came home and wrote the book, Arkansas Men of War. As governor of Arkansas, he was wrongly accused by Kenneth Starr of mail fraud during the Watergate investigations of President Clinton. With failing health caused by a life-threatening autoimmune disease, he pled guilty to a lesser charge, all the while awaiting a liver transplant. This unfortunate bargaining may have saved his life, but it cost him his political career. Years later, after finding nothing to charge him of, the case was dropped, and he received an apology letter and a refund check from the United States government. The felony charge remains on his record. And if that's not interesting enough, there is even more. But I will let our former Arkansas prosecuting attorney, state attorney general, lieutenant governor, congressman, and 43rd governor tell you for himself. It is a pleasure, an honor, and a special treat to welcome to the table Honorable Jim Guy Tucker, Jr.
Well, thanks a lot. Delighted to be with you.
So we were talking before the show, and I called you the comeback kid, and you're like, what are you talking about? My life is great. I've had the most wonderful life in the whole world. I kind of listed a few things like I just did, and you're like, oh, my life is wonderful. He's got the best attitude of anybody I know. For our listeners who are scratching their head at the swashbuckler adjective that I stole from Ernie Dumas's book and used to describe you, let me define the term. A swashbuckler is a heroic archetype in European adventure literature that is typified by the use of a sword, acrobatics, and chivalric ideas. But it didn't begin with you. Your grandfather was a city marshal.
My father's father was Guy B. Tucker, Guy Beckwith Tucker, and he was later active in politics and went to the Democratic Convention and nominated Wilson for Arkansas back in 1912. But my father was born in 1892, so it's a long time ago. And my grandfather was city marshal of El Dorado. It was a rough town at the time, and they had a feud between the Tuckers and the Parnells, in addition to his serving as the city marshal. And they had a horrible shootout. The Arkansas Gazette carried a big headline saying Marshall killed, and in fact he should have been. But he did survive and continued being marshal. Later was elected state commissioner of lands, and then got on into politics. But he was ambushed before that while he was marshal. He was riding back out to their little house outside of El Dorado and on a little creek north of the city, and was ambushed and had his left arm blown off. My father was on horseback behind him and had been scolded on a previous trip for dropping some of the mail, but he held on to this mail, and he explained to his father that he hadn't lost any mail. But he survived that and then moved to Little Rock and was active, as I say, in politics there. So my genes on that side run back pretty far. My grandfather on my mother's side was named White, F.O. White, and he was county judge in White County in Searcy for about 15, 16 years. And he was succeeded by a fellow who came home from Harvard and beat him in the election. And his name was Wilbur Mills.
Whoa.
And that is whom I ended up succeeding when he left Congress, when he resigned or did not run for re-election in Congress. I followed him, and he had always been nice to me, and we were friends during my lifetime.
Was your father-in-law still alive?
No, my father.
So he didn't get to see you.
My grandfather died in 1922, and my father died in 1960.
But Mr. White didn't get to see you take over Wilbur D. Mills' seat?
No, he did not. He was gone long before that. In
Your
fact,
father,
he died in front of me at breakfast when he was at our little rent house on Stonewall Road, 5413 Stonewall. It was a little tiny brick house, tiny place. We had a couple of chickens in the backyard, and Dad would wring their necks for Sunday breakfast. I'd go watch a headless chicken run around back there. But he was eating breakfast with me one morning when he was visiting and had a heart attack and died there in front of me.
People that don't know, Stonewall is now right in front of the country club. Is the street that runs?
It runs close. This was 2 blocks from what was in the Heights Theater, but the house that's replaced it is immense.
A mansion.
And it's probably
so you were wringing chickens' necks in the back.
$1,000,000.
Yeah, you're wringing chickens' necks back right up there in the Heights. The richest part
I went to Forest Park. It was 3 blocks away. Great school, wonderful teachers. Had a lot of. It was all women teachers, but they were mostly women whose husbands had gone off to World War II in Korea. So they were beautifully educated and they were great teachers. But their husbands were not there. One of them's husband was killed.
Your father was World War I.
He fought in World War I. That's right. He was in the Meuse Argonne and St. Mihiel offensives.
So in the opening, I called you the comeback kid, which I mentioned earlier, and you said, I'm not the comeback kid. I've got the best life in the world. But let's just start with number 1. After Harvard, you joined the Marines only to be honorably discharged for stomach ulcers. But determined to serve, you still found a way to Vietnam on a tramp steamer. A tramp steamer. Tell us about that.
Well, the disease I had was what's called an autoimmune disease. So your immune system decides to attack itself.
And they didn't know that probably back then.
No, they barely recognized it, but they decided there was some problem. I had joined the Marines in 1961, my freshman year in college. So I was in the Marine Reserve, and when I finished Quantico and we did our final physical, they picked it up and ultimately they ranked me 4F, but I appealed. And after I had started practice law, I won my appeal. They reclassified me 1A, but I had been to Vietnam twice by that point, and I didn't much feel like going back.
But you did go back. You got on a tramp steamer, which is a freight liner.
I got on a ship called the Beaver State out of San Francisco, and I was a wiper. I wiped stuff up.
So like swab the decks?
And they let me steer the ship one time, and they enjoyed it immensely. After I'd steered it for 5 minutes or so, they took over the wheel, and they asked me to step out back and have a look at my pathway. I said, how do you look at your pathway? And it was midnight, and we were crossing from San Francisco. You go north, and then come down the eastern side of China to our ports we were headed to. But the sea is full of phosphorescence, so when the ship passes, you end up with this bright silver trail that guides you. Except my silver trail looked like a silver rope that was coiled there from my back and forth trying to stay on course.
Jim Guy, you have done so much.
It was fun. I had a
How
great
old are
life
you?
growing up.
How old are you?
Well, I am now in my 77th year, which means I'm 76. I've got a birthday in June.
No, I mean when you were doing the freight liner.
I was 21.
Think how much he's done already at 21. So you're a freelance. This is pretty adventurous. You just take off.
Yeah.
You're not hired by anybody. You're like, I think I'll just get on this boat and go down there and see what happens.
I was still young and immortal.
That's right.
So just go do it.
So what'd you do when you got there?
Well, the stops I made were instructive. The first place I stopped was in Japan and Yokohama, as I recall. But anyway, it was a city that had been just devastated by the bombs. This is 1964 or 65. It had just turned 65. And the city was still a pile of rubble. and the people that were moving around, they'd been blasted, and some of them had horrible injuries from nuclear explosions. And so if you want a real picture of war, how Japan looked after World War II would have given it to you at that time. I then went over to Busan, Korea, which had been the site of a horrible battle during the Korean War, and it looked just about the same. So that was instructive as I headed on down south. I was supposed to teach at Thomas Hart University, but I ran into the editor of a newspaper down there who visited with me, and he said, "You ought to go to Vietnam." And he called over, and so I went over and got a job at the Saigon Post in Saigon, and started traveling to all over the country for stories on the war as it was progressing.
Who were you with? Were you with the military?
No, I was a civilian. I had a.
Do you speak Vietnamese?
I could not speak Vietnamese, but very few of the troops there could. I learned a little bit while I was there, but I was an accredited reporter, and I had a ID card and a uniform and a helmet and a vest, and I traveled. I was in every section of the country. It was divided into I Corps, 2 Corps, 3 Corps, 4 Corps, and so forth. But I spent time in every one of the areas of Vietnam.
How did it change you?
Well, I remembered the John Wayne movies and the great heroics of the folks in battle running over the enemy and surviving everything. And this was a very quick lesson in what a lie that was. Wars are absolutely horrible. We have them going on even today all over the world. And you frequently have people who are rooting for wars, and these tend to be folks who have no idea of what they're talking about. They just think they're tough and they've got big guns, and that let's go to war.
Mm-hmm. And your kids go, not mine.
It's a horrible thing, horrible thing.
So you come back from Vietnam. What's the first thing you do?
Well, I had been admitted to law school, so I went to my first year of law school at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. Worked at a filling station, Conoco station. I worked 18 hours on Sundays. I'd go in Sunday morning at 6 a.m. Late morning, I'd wash the vomit from the boyfriends out of the sorority girls' cars.
Oh, no.
And,
no, I didn't expect that.
And I didn't have to fill much gas because it was just a slow day, but he needed someone in the station, and I could study virtually all the time. And I locked up at midnight, and went home. And then I worked at another service station just 3 days a week. But that made me a little bit of money. But I was still wanting to go roam some more, so I was asked to come to Beirut. So I went to Beirut that summer of '66. To teach at American University at Beirut. And I went down to Israel too, but of course they are adjacent to each other. But in order to go to Israel at that time, I had to fly out to Cyprus, then fly back into Israel. And they stamped a piece of paper. If they stamped my passport, I couldn't get back into Lebanon. But I laid on that island waiting for my time for my plane to come, and I had to go back to the airport. And I had a little bottle of wine, or a sack of wine, and I had some wonderful fruit from the tree, and I sat under that tree on Cyprus and sipped that and thought the world was good. Went on to Israel and got a sense of the wars and the problems there. Went back to Lebanon, and but decided what I needed to do was go ahead and finish law school. So I did go back to Fayetteville again in late September. Did that year of law school, and I wasn't working at the service station. I was concentrating on learning the law and making my grades. But then the next summer came along, and I had really been pondering the the wars and the war zones I'd seen. And so I decided to go back to Vietnam. So a group of 13 or 14 newspapers here in the state all hired me, and each paid a little bit of the money. And I flew back to Vietnam and went to find Arkansas soldiers who were there in the various war zones. And so later I put all those stories together in a little book called Arkansas Men at War. But they were all stories I had written in Vietnam. Had a fellow named Roger Armbrust back here in Little Rock who edited what I sent back to him and what was published in the papers. So then I came back to law school and started practice with the Rose Law Firm in 1968.
That's a good story. So you also went on police raids when you got back.
When I was a brand new prosecutor, I got elected prosecutor in 1970. Campaigned with Dale Bumpers, was running for governor that year. But I had met Winthrop Rockefeller when he was running for governor, and I'll tell you that story when you're ready.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Tell me the story of meeting Winthrop. What did we say Ernie Dumas said about Winthrop Rockefeller? Misunderstood or?
Well, he was from New York and had been here, and he did some wonderful things, and I really liked him, and he liked me. And when he became governor, John Haley, who was a lawyer at the Rose Law Firm where I was practicing, came in to see me one day and asked me how I'd like to go to prison. And I said, "Explain yourself, my friend." He had been appointed chairman of the Board of Corrections by Rockefeller, and at that time the inmates ran the penitentiary effectively, and they had weapons. The trustees had weapons in the towers, and they were the guards as well. But people were being released earlier than they should have been released. So Haley asked me if I'd go down and be a prisoner and take a little bit of money in with me, enough that would catch a little bit of attention and see what happened, because they thought they knew how these folks were being released early.
You are the Attorney General now,
no,
or
I'm
you
just
are still working at the Rose Law Firm, just a guy?
Yeah, he was a partner there. I was a brand new attorney and didn't know what I was doing half the time.
And he said, "Hey, I heard you're a swashbuckler. Why don't you go down there and go to jail, be undercover at the state penitentiary?"
So I went in, and the job I had, I was only there 2 days because Winthrop Rockefeller, the Governor Rockefeller, found out what Haley had done, and he was madder than heck. Told him to get me out of there. But my job was cleaning chickens, and I walked into this small room of just maybe 12 feet by 12 feet maximum, a huge table in the middle, and there was this other convict in there in a stark white uniform. I mean, his uniform was spotless, and he was deeply angry, and he was cursing, and as the chickens came in, he took this huge meat cleaver and raised it over his head, and whack, it came down, and chicken guts and stuff went everywhere. And I had a decent-sized cleaver, and I was over there going chick, 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 and being pretty damn gentle. And I asked him what he was so angry about, and he said that he had his parole hearing that day, and he'd made some of the trustees angry, and so they sent him to do this job before he went in for his parole hearing, and he was in for a violent crime, so he went in covered in blood, literally covered in blood and guts. He did not get a parole.
Oh.
But later on, while I was there, a trustee approached me and asked me if I'd like to get out a little early, and I said I sure would. He said, "Well, I noticed how much money you brought in. You got that receipt with you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "If you'll let me have that receipt, I'll make a little arrangement back there so your records look like it's time to let you out." And that's what they were doing. They had custody of the records that determined when you were released under the control of the prisoners instead of at a different location and separated.
That's not rocket scientists not to do that.
That was amazing. But at any rate, that was my only experience. Then,
and you were called James Gus Turner.
Yeah, I wanted.
You went
to
in
have
under the name alias James Gus Turner.
I wanted to use the same name I had or something very close to it, so that if somebody spoke to me, I would react to the name.
Oh, smart undercover.
So that's why I was.
See, I read that and thought, well, that's not very smart. He used a name almost like his, but now I understand the philosophy behind that.
Yep.
You also went in there to clean up kind of some police corruption, I think, didn't you? Was there some police corruption too? Was that?
Well, for example, just to give you a sense of it, we're all familiar with the Marion Hotel and how wonderful it is here in town that the Stevens have fixed up so nicely.
Well, that's the Capitol Hotel, but the Marion was.
I called it the Marion.
The Marion was across the street.
I meant the Capitol. Yeah. The Marion was across the street. But at the Capitol Hotel, I kept being told the east end of town, where the Clinton Center is and the buildings in there, were just there. It was so bad. We had at least one shooting, assault, or rape down there every night of the week. So our docket was full, jail was full, and the police had put 10 over the window so they couldn't shout out the window at people going by, and they'd taken the mattress off the beds because they'd tear them up, so they were sleeping on springs.
You're talking about at the jail down there?
That was the county jail that is now gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's set where the park is on the river there now. But in any event, one day I was walking past the Marion Hotel with my chief deputy, Robert J. Brown, and I said, let's just stick our head in here. So I went to the desk and asked to see their register if they didn't mind. I said, I can go get a warrant, but if you don't object, I'll look at your register. And he said, oh, no, you can look at it. And he turned it around, and the customers had unusually short stays and unusually similar names. By short stays, I mean an hour. So this was a house of prostitution. There was a pool hall down there and a bar, but the hotel itself was a house of prostitution. And they were about 7 blocks from the police station and the chief of police. And so I went from there to the chief of police office, and we had a serious misunderstanding about how things needed to run in the criminal justice system. There was a backlog of about 2,000 cases waiting trial, and because we didn't have any public defender or system, we did pass one
while you were
subsequently
there.
While I was governor, while I was attorney general, actually. But the cases just backed up because the folks who'd been charged were waiting to be able to get their families to pay a fee to the lawyers that were representing them. And it took forever. And so you just had this horrible, horrible backup in county facilities that people who should have either been released or sent to the state prison.
So your career spans from 73 to 96 with a break in there. And we're not going to talk about the break. That's when you were in Asia. But you were the former Arkansas prosecuting attorney that we've been talking about, the state attorney general, the lieutenant governor, a congressman, and the 43rd governor. In 1973 to 1979, you were prosecuting attorney and the state attorney. Then you took a break because you ran for, I think.
I was prosecutor for one term, 71 and 72, and then attorney general for 2 terms. These were 2-year terms. Mm-hmm. And suddenly Wilbur Mills resigned, or didn't resign, but he didn't run for re-election for Congress. So I ran and was elected and was on the Ways and Means Committee. And then we had John McClellan die, and his Senate seat came up. So David Pryor and I and Ray Thornton and a 4th person all ran. And the race was extremely close. All 3 of David and Ray Thornton and I got the same major percentage of the votes, that is 33%. But the 4th guy got a little less than 1% of the vote. And so I was in a runoff with David, but it was because I had a tiny edge over Ray Thornton, and David had a tiny edge over me, but he beat me in the runoff. We remained good friends, and are still friends today. But that was.
And so then you went into becoming a businessman.
I started law practice again after that. I'd had a lot of legal experience at that point. Tried some big cases, and got to try some even bigger cases. But Mitchell Williams law firm hired me, and I became a partner in Mitchell Williams, Seelig, Jackson, and Tucker, and I did litigation. But in the meantime, my wife, who also was a lawyer, she just graduated from law school, started practicing law. But one of our clients was a guy who wanted to build a cable TV system, and cable TV was brand new. So we started building one. We had a table set up at a filling station and near Mall Mill, which was just being built at that time. And we started selling subscriptions, and we had a little tower and cable that we'd run. And Betty and I went off for a ski trip to Denver, and when we came back, we went to the post office to see if we'd gotten any checks in, any payments in. And I opened our mailbox, and it said, "See Postmaster." There was a little note that said, "See Postmaster," nothing else. So I went down to the postmaster and gave him that, and he came back out with this sack that was absolutely full of checks. And Betty and I opened it. We didn't know, we opened it, and here were all these checks. They weren't big checks, but there were a lot of them. Uh-huh. And we looked at each other, and we said, let's go do a little driving and see where else we might build cable systems. So we built everything on the edge of Little Rock and North Little Rock, built a circle around it, almost a total circle around it. Then we built part of a little town north of here, north of Little Rock. And then we built, I was trying a case down in Texas, and one of the guys on the city council was from Benton, Arkansas. And I started talking to him. He was on the city council of Southlake, Texas. And we started building systems down there. So we built all or parts of most of the cities north of DFW. And you know how huge they are now. Mm-hmm. And then we bought a little system down in Florida. And all of a sudden we started getting offers to buy these. And they were paying $4,000 per subscriber. And we had a lot of subscribers. And I said, "Yep, we'll do that."
Did you sell them all?
We sold all the U.S. ones, and then I'd gotten a call about a guy who had died, and they told me he had a lot of franchises in England. And I won't go through the long story, but we did a contract on a napkin in New York with his trustee with dinner. And we got a franchise for London, parts of London and Wales. So we went over and looked at that and built parts of the system over there. And later that got merged with another company, and that was profitable. We tried very hard to build a system in southern France. Betty had lived in France.
Loved it.
And gone to school as a child. When her father was called back up to the Korean War, he was chief officer at an Air Force base there. But at any rate, she loved France from her time there as a child, several years, went to local public school and everything. Mm-hmm. So we tried to make that system work, but it didn't. And many years later, I got visited by some folks who lived in Indonesia, and they asked me if I'd help them build a system in Indonesia. So later on, when I had recovered from one of the surgeries, the last surgery I had, the liver transplant, we went to Jakarta, and we built all of Jakarta and Surabaya and Bali. Bali was nice. And all of them, we built not only cable systems, but by then we were building internet systems at the same time. And we had a condo in Hong Kong, And so we lived in Hong Kong most of the time, and that's when we did the Heifer Project work up there.
Great stories. I got to tell everybody that you're listening to Up in Your Business with me, Kerry McCoy, and I'm speaking today with the Honorable Jim Guy Tucker, 43rd Governor of Arkansas. So comeback kid number 2. We already did number 1. You were a Marine, and you went, and you had an honorable discharge, but you still managed to go over there as a war correspondent. Number 2, you lose the governor's race to Bill Clinton that you mentioned. Well, no, we hadn't talked about the governor's race, have we?
Yeah, no, I got beat by Bill for governor, but, I didn't get beat by Bill for governor. I started to run against him for governor. Maybe I did get beat by him for governor.
And then you ran for lieutenant governor.
But later, I started to run again because he was clearly going to run for president. And then I thought, I believe he's going to win the presidency. I'm going to run for lieutenant.
You're the only person that thought that.
Lieutenant governor. So I ran for lieutenant governor. He got elected, and I became governor. One of the hardest things about the lieutenant governorship at that time was the Arkansas Constitution provided that if the governor was out of the state, the lieutenant governor became governor. Now, this was written back in the 1800s, and when people left the state, they were out of communication. So when someone's running for president, they're being watched by the press all the time, and he was leaving the state all the time to run for governor. So you have his staff there who've worked with him, and he's the governor, but officially he can't sign anything, he can't do anything that is a governor's decision while he is out of the state. And if he does, somebody who's against him is going to catch it.
Yeah.
And they're going to hatch it.
Catch it and hatch it.
And,
yeah.
So
you were acting governor.
It was almost impossible. My law firm let me go serve, and I presided over the state senate as well. But it was increasingly interfering, and finally it became so bad he was just almost gone permanently. So I simply resigned from the law firm so I didn't have a conflict. And there can't be as much money being the lieutenant governor or the governor as being a corporate president of a cable company. That's right. So you really spent 10 years building this cable business, and then you come back, I don't understand why, and go back into political office. I liked public service. You did. I think it's a wonderful thing for people to do who have an interest and want to learn about a lot of different things and try and make education, for example, which was my primary concern, better, or other things better. They have the opportunity to try and do it. Describe politics in those days. It's not like it is today. Describe how politics was then. Well, when I first started politics in 1970, it was a completely different thing. It was Wild West. It pretty much was. The ballots, the ballots. I went in to see a guy over in East Arkansas who was a big plantation owner, and we'd done our counting of how many votes we needed where, and in his precinct or his area of the county, if I could just get, a handful of votes, I'd be thrilled. But I wanted more than 1%. If I could get 18, 19%, I'd be thrilled. So he was sitting in his chair with his jodhpurs up on the desk and his Stetson pushed back on his head, and he had a riding crop he was slapping his thigh with. And he said, "Well, Tucker," he said, "you're a nice-looking young man." He said, "We're going to give you," and he pushed his Stetson back a little further with his riding crop. He said, "We're going to give you about 18% of the vote." I said, "Mr. So-and-so, sir, I sure do appreciate that." And I left, and that's precisely what I got in his precinct over there. That was one example of things that happened all over the state. It was before voting booths. Racial mistreatment was rampant still at the time, and we've changed dramatically, but it was not an attractive thing to see, but it did inspire me to want to change what I saw, and that's the sort of thing I got to work on as time went by, is changing that kind of politics. Winthrop Rockefeller had the biggest impact on changing that, and he was followed then by Dale Bumpers, and then he was followed by David Pryor.
Great.
And he was followed by Bill Clinton, and every one of those governors, and I came along after that, all of us wanted to clean that election system up and get the state no longer engaging in that, and we did.
You and Bill Clinton were on the same side, but by the end you had become rivals, don't you think?
Well, we were rivals when I ran against him, and when I was serving as his lieutenant governor. But we actually became real allies, and we had the same viewpoint on virtually all issues that were out there.
Mm-hmm. Y'all remind me of each other a lot. Okay, Comeback Kid 3. While acting governor of Arkansas, you became ill with a life-threatening autoimmune disease. They'd finally diagnosed it, which you eventually got a liver transplant for, and you're here today. It was great news.
Christmas Day of 1996.
Were you one of the first Arkansans to go to the Mayo Clinic and get a liver transplant?
I would have been one of the first ones. I wasn't the first. I know some of the fellows who were, but I was among the first to have a liver transplant, yes.
So here is the conversation that everybody has been waiting for. Comeback number 4. While awaiting a liver donor, the Whitewater investigations ensued while you were governor. In your 1996 interview, you denied all wrongdoing and went on to say about Kenneth Starr process that it is a selective prosecution driven by Bill Clinton being president.
Well, driven by Bill Clinton being president is correct. They were after Bill Clinton. Kenneth Starr, who was once more back in the news, will recall his tenure at Baylor University, and folks don't remember it, go online and have a look at it and how it ended. That's the kind of fellow I viewed him as being.
Well, how did it end? You've got to tell me just quickly. I don't even know.
Well, the honesty is the issue. And the first indictment they obtained against me, I was stunned. It alleged this huge tax loss to the government of $3 million plus, and the question was, the indictment didn't mention what statute existed that created that kind of tax loss. They had this great conspiracy they described, but okay, well, to calculate it and see how do you get there? And the Republican judges that I had, the Democrats had all recused because they knew me and there were conflicts, would not make Kenneth Starr tell us what statute he was using. Finally, many years later, when the Justice Department took over the case, Kenneth Starr had disappeared. They admitted in court that which tax statute applied, and they admitted that they might owe me a refund rather than my owing them $3 million. And I said, I want that refund. I said, you can jimmy around all you want to with penalties and stuff, but I want the refund. And so I've got the check. It was, I think it was $1.99 or something that they gave me. But I hung it on my wall.
You framed it?
I framed it, and it's hanging there now.
$1.99.
But I mean, that's pretty incredible. You charge a sitting governor. I was a sitting governor when they charged me with a crime. Now, why would they do that? Well, the tax law that existed at that time, had I been found guilty, would have given me a sentence of like 10 years because it was based in part on the amount of loss, and it was mandatory, and the judge could not reduce it. You had to give that kind of sentence. And what they wanted me to do was to remember a conversation that I heard between Bill Clinton and David Hale, which I simply never heard. There was no such thing. But they were trying to assure that they could get Bill Clinton. So that's what those prosecutions were about. And I was not helpful to them because he did not do anything that they wanted me to testify to, period.
They wanted you to lie to save your skin.
Damn right.
And Susan McDougal did the same thing, right?
They did the same thing to Susan McDougal, yes.
And to her husband?
As far as I know.
And to her husband?
No, her husband was in fact involved in crimes.
Oh, he was?
And he may not have thought of it as being criminal. I don't know. He had an initial criminal trial, and he had asked me to testify on his behalf, but he had, in fact, taken money from me. He'd signed my name to a bunch of deeds that we were joint property owners on, and when the money was paid, he did not use it to pay off the mortgages, and so when he asked me to testify for him, I told him I couldn't do it.
Is that what Whitewater was about?
It was about one of the others, but yes, it was about real estate that he and Bill Clinton, that Bill Clinton was a part owner in up in North Arkansas.
That he had again
and
sold.
I don't know what he did with that with Bill Clinton, but what he did not do is have a conversation in front of me or around me or tell me about it or anything else. They figured that I disliked Clinton so much because he'd beat me, because I'd been his lieutenant governor and had some arguments with his staff about who was governor when he was out of state. They thought I would testify against him and that I'd be happy and willing to go along in return for a reduced or a dismissal even of charges, and they just guessed wrong. But
you did. Because you were in poor health at the time, awaiting a liver transplant, you did decide to plead to a lesser crime.
On the tax case, yeah.
Thus, giving you probation to stay at your house for 4 years? Were you?
No, it's more complicated than that. There was another. That was the first indictment, and it got the tax case, and it got dismissed by Judge Henry Woods. Starr then wanted Woods to be dismissed from the case because he was a Democrat. He didn't say that, but he was a Democrat. But he was friends with Hillary Clinton. And, so anyway, they wanted that case dismissed. I went to the Eighth Circuit, and it didn't get reinstated until after I had been through a trial on another charge. And by that time, I was so sick that I did not testify in the case. I went up to Mayo Clinic after the jury came in, and had I testified, I think I would have been acquitted. But had I testified, I was at risk of being cross-examined on the tax case, which they had still not admitted what tax statute they were using. So it was a hard call for me and for the attorneys who were advising me.
But the stress level would have probably been too much for your health at the time. So you saved your life, most likely. When Bill Clinton was president, he pardoned Susan McDougal?
Yes. Yes.
Yes?
He did give a pardon to Susan.
But he did not you?
Not to me. He gave a pardon to some multimillionaire that got a lot of bad press, and I doubt if he could have pardoned me without taking a lot of problems with it again.
So even though they never found anything, because you did, I was surprised that because you did plead to a lesser crime, they went ahead and kept the felon there, and you did not get pardoned from it, and
that's right.
It's still there. So I want to tell everybody you're listening to Up in Your Business with me, Kerry McCoy, and I'm speaking today with the Honorable Jim Guy Tucker, 43rd Governor of Arkansas. And he is a successful international businessman, and he was the Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General, the Congressman, and our 43rd Governor, who has, in 2012, began donating your photos, your personal papers, and your documents to UALR. And currently, there are over 1,000 boxes that have been donated, archived, and are made public. And you said, I think this is funny, what you said, I know a lot of folks have the staff and the resources to have their boxes and stuff edited thoroughly before they deliver them, and I've not been able to do that very much. What was in there was what was in there. You went on to say, I tried to glance at it, but I'm sure there'll be some surprises, and undoubtedly there'll be something that's embarrassing at some point. I tried to avoid putting letters from my old girlfriends in there. He's blushing. You are really blushing.
Well, that's correct. The blushing and the letters as well.
So what's in there?
Well,
there's you've probably got lots of cases that are in there. Some interesting cases you tried.
Yeah. Well, I can't have anything that would violate the attorney-client privilege, so I don't have any of my private law cases. But I do have various records from the public cases. I have some of the raw notes that I wrote in the field in Vietnam, and some that I typed up. And typing is awful, and the handwriting's awful. But I'd send those notes or the terrible handwriting home to Roger Armbrust, and he'd read them and edit them up, and they became.
So I ordered your book, Arkansas's
Men at War.
Men at War, but it didn't arrive in time for me to read it.
No.
I wanted to have you sign it.
Doesn't take long, and it's got pictures.
How many pages is it?
It's a little over 100.
I wanted you to sign it. I have to come by and get you to autograph it for me.
Feel free.
So you have pictures of you with Jimmy Carter in your archives. The archivalist at UALR said that they very rarely, UALR is the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, said they very rarely have such deep personal papers given to the school that is so broad.
Well, it's got they asked us to write our autobiography when I was in the 6th grade at Forest Park. So it's got my baby shoes and pictures of my mother and father and all sorts of stuff like that, and my handwriting in it. So it goes all the way back to stuff like that, I was delighted to give it to them. It's stored downtown, and they've taken pictures of it in some fashion with their technology. Mm-hmm. So it stores, but it's a lot of stuff. I hope my kids won't be embarrassed by any of it. I don't think they will.
Jim Guy Tucker, thank you for being a shining example of never give up, work hard, public service, honesty. You are one of the most honest, what you see is what you get kind of guys I've ever read about. I absolutely enjoyed learning about you, and I got you a gift. I maybe should have put China in here. This is a desk set of the U.S. flag, Arkansas flag, Oklahoma, because you were born in Oklahoma. And the last one is Indonesia. And you say Indonesia.
It's almost a flag and banner.
It is. How do you say Indonesia?
Indonesia.
Indonesia.
Yeah. And Surabaya, Jakarta, Jopabotebek.
I don't even know what any of those are. That's because he's been living overseas a long time. Gray, who's our guest next week?
Next week we'll be doing we'll be revisiting your interview with Attorney General Steve Clark.
Oh, from your era, Steve Clark. He's a great guy. He was very humble and it was a great interview. Thank you for spending time with us. To our listeners, we hope you've heard or learned something that's been inspiring or enlightening, and that whatever it is, it will help you up your business, your independence, or your life. I'm Kerry McCoy, and I'll see you next time on Up in Your Business. Until then, be brave and keep it up.
You've been listening to Up in Your Business with Kerry McCoy. For links to resources you heard discussed on today's show, go to flagandbanner.com, select radio, and choose today's guest. All interviews are recorded and posted the following week. Stay informed of exciting upcoming guests by subscribing to our YouTube channel or podcasts, wherever you like to listen. Kerry's goal is simple: to help you live the American dream.
One break.
My first break, where I read.
Because I didn't want to break, because he had too good a stuff.
Yeah,
I was not going to break. Man. We would not have gotten through it all so good.
Well, thank you. You're very gentle.
Very gentle.
I would love to have. If you all put that on disc.
I'm going to send it to you. It's on the internet. You'll just be able to click on it on YouTube. It'll be on YouTube.